The most feared building in Victorian England was one you had to ask to be let into. June 1896. A 7-year-old boy stood at a workhouse gate in South London, holding his mother's hand. Past the gate, the routine took over. They bathed him, took away his clothes, and gave him the uniform. His mother went to the women's ward, and he went with the children. 3 weeks later, a horse-drawn bakery van carried him out to a school for pauper children at Hanwell, and he stayed there for 19 months. He caught ringworm, so they shaved his head and painted it with iodine, and the other boys laughed. The boy's name was Charlie Chaplin. 30 years on, his face was one of the most famous on earth, and the costume that made it famous was a tramp's. Here's the thing about the place that took him in. It was not a charity gone wrong. It was a machine designed by Parliament 62 years before that morning, and it ran on fear, on purpose, by law, and in writing. So that's the story this time. How the machine was built, what a day inside it cost, and who it actually caught. Start with the strangest fact about the workhouse. Nobody was sentenced to it. There was no trial, no warrant, no escort. You asked to go in. And the whole design hangs on that one word because a system people must ask for can be tuned. You simply make the asking cost exactly as much as you want it to. The tuning happened in 1834. That summer, Parliament passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, and it rebuilt the relief of poverty in England and Wales around one building. The blueprint came from a royal commission. One of its authors was an economist named Nassau Sr. The other driving hand belonged to Edwin Chadwick, the commission's most relentless administrator. Their report ran on a single principle, and the principle had a name: less eligibility. Life inside the workhouse must be less eligible, less comfortable, less desirable than the life of the poorest independent laborer outside it. Sit with that calibration. The poorest free laborer in England lived cold and hungry. The workhouse had to sit below him, not by neglect, by design. And the elegance of it, on paper, was that nobody had to judge anybody. The offer itself was a test. Make the house grim enough, and only the truly desperate would accept. So everyone who walked away had just proved they had another option. That was the theory. 15,000 parishes were merged into a few hundred new unions, and union by union, the new buildings went up. The poor had a name for them before the paint dried. A campaigner named Wythen Baxter collected the early horror stories into a book in 1841, and his title used the word everyone was already using: the Book of the Bastilles. So say the winter beats you and you ask, what actually happened? First, a relieving officer hears your case and a board of guardians approves it, sometimes with you standing in front of them to explain yourself. Then the house takes over. You wait in a probationary ward while the medical officer looks you over. You are stripped and bathed. Your own clothes get washed, disinfected, and put into store with everything else you own to be returned when you leave. You get the uniform. A child could be required to have their hair cut. And then the machine does the thing everyone dreaded most. It sorts you. The rules split every household into 7 classes: aged and infirm men, able-bodied men and boys above 13, boys between 7 and 13, aged and infirm women, able-bodied women and girls above 16, girls between 7 and 16, and children under 7. Each class got its own ward and its own yard, so a family walked in through one door and came apart into as many as 5. A husband and wife slept in separate wards, however long they had been married. From 1847, a couple over 60 could request a shared bedroom, and plenty of boards never got round to providing one. Some argued, in writing, that the old couples preferred it that way. A mother kept a child under 7 near her only if the guardians thought fit. From 1842, she was allowed access to her own child at all reasonable times, which is a rule you only need to write down if somebody has been refusing. Parents were entitled to an interview with their children, 1 in each day. You could leave whenever you wanted, though. That was the other half of the voluntary trick. 3 hours notice. But a man who discharged himself took his whole family out of the house with him, fed or not. The door swung both ways, and both ways it swung on his choice. Now, say you stayed. Your day ran on a bell. The commissioners printed the timetable in 1835. You were up at 6 in summer, 7 in winter, and half an hour after the bell, a roll call checked you were still there. Breakfast. Then work at 7 or 8 when the mornings were dark. Dinner from 12 to 1. Work again until 6. Supper. Bed at 8, all year round, every year the same. The meals had a rule of their own, and in 1835 it was written exactly like this: silence, order, and decorum shall be maintained. You ate without speaking. 7 years later, the commissioners relented slightly. They dropped the word silence. Order and decorum stayed. And what was in front of you? The commissioners issued 6 model dietaries, and every union picked one and posted it on the wall. The famous item was gruel, and gruel had a recipe. A doctor named Edward Smith later wrote the standard version down: 2 ounces of oatmeal to the pint of water, half an ounce of treacle, and salt. That was breakfast. With bread, most places. Wythe and Baxter's book had already put the comparison in print in 1841. The workhouse diet was worse than the diet given to transported convicts, which is why the most famous scene in Victorian fiction is set exactly here. Charles Dickens began serializing Oliver Twist in 1837. 3 years into the new system, and the scene the whole world remembers is a workhouse boy carrying his bowl up to the master. Please, sir, I want some more. The room freezes, and every reader in 1837 understood the freeze because they knew what the book knew. In that building, asking for more was an event. But the gruel still had to be earned because idleness was the enemy the whole machine had been aimed at. The able-bodied men got work that was deliberately hard, deliberately dull, and easy to measure. Stone breaking, weighed when you finished, sold for mending roads, corn to grind. Corn to grind, wood to chop. And oakum, which meant old tarred ship's rope, cut into lengths and teased apart, strand by strand until your fingertips split. Because the loose fiber sold to the shipyards for caulking hulls. The women ran the house itself, the laundry, the kitchen, the scrubbing, the sewing, and in the ledgers, all that labor looks almost like a town. At Macclesfield in 1888, the house recorded 21 washers, 22 sewers, and 12 scrubbers on the women's side, and on the men's side, 2 joiners, a slater, a blacksmith, 18 potato peelers, and 26 wardmen, with 12 boys learning tailoring. A whole economy, running inside the walls, paid in gruel. Nobody worked on Sundays, Good Friday, or Christmas Day. It was that kind of mercy. Precise, listed, and small. And one job was worse than all of it, and one house made it a national scandal. At Andover, in Hampshire, the able-bodied men crushed bones. Old bones came in by the ton from the dealers, and the men pounded them to dust with a 28-pound iron rammer, and the dust sold as fertilizer. Boys as young as 8 worked in that yard. Stand in it for a moment. The dust settles on you, hour after hour, and you are hungry, and the next cart is always coming. The master of the house was Colin MacDougall, a former sergeant major who had fought at Waterloo, and under his management, the men in the boneyard were hungry enough that a fresh bone was worth fighting for. In 1845, the story got out of the yard. The paupers of Andover were eating the bones. One of the union's own guardians, Hugh Mundy, refused to let it drop. And on the 1st of August 1845, the question was put to the government on the floor of the House of Commons by Thomas Walkley. Walkley was a coroner, and he had founded a medical journal called The Lancet. Hold that name, it comes back. The inquiry that followed put the men of the boneyard on the record. One of them was Samuel Green, age 61. He told the committee that the men could tell the fresh bones by the look of them. And then we used to be like a parcel of dogs after them. He ate the marrow stale and stinking, he said, because I was hungered. 3 months after Walkley stood up, the commissioners gave ground on the job itself. In November 1845, a general order banned bone crushing in the workhouse. Note the date because no committee had met yet. The committee came anyway. It sat in March 1846, and its report filled 2 volumes. It condemned the master and his wife as unfit. It condemned the guardians who had let the house run that way, and the assistant commissioner who had missed it. And it walked the blame all the way up to the Poor Law Commission itself. In 1847, the commission was abolished and replaced with a board that answered to Parliament. So, what did the scandal of the age actually change? Say you walked up to that same gate 5 years on. What was different? The name on the letterhead and one job in one yard. The building stayed. The principle stayed. The queue at the gate stayed. A machine built to be feared had been caught working, and the fix was to make it a little harder to catch. Well, the boneyard was the cruelty a committee could see. The slower story was in the wards, because by mid-century the workhouse had quietly become something nobody designed it to be, the hospital of the poor. Fall seriously ill with no money in Victorian England, and the workhouse infirmary was where you ended up. The nursing there was done by fellow inmates, untrained pauper women, and the brandy prescribed for the patients had a habit of vanishing on its way down the ward. Then the deaths started reaching the newspapers. One of them was a laborer named Timothy Daly, who died in the infirmary of the Holborn workhouse, and whose case was investigated all the way up to the minister's desk. And in 1865, the Lancet, Walkley's journal, told you it was coming back, sent its own doctors into the London workhouse infirmaries and printed what they found, ward by ward. At St. George, the Martyr in Southwark, they found 30 men sharing one privy, and the privy had been without water for more than a week, right next to the ward where the men slept. Florence Nightingale had been pressing the same case for years, and now the country was finally listening. In 1867, a minister named Gathorne Hardy took the Metropolitan Poor Act through Parliament. The sick were to be moved out of the workhouses into separate infirmaries under a new Metropolitan Asylums Board, and nursing became a trade with a year's training, so the trained slowly replaced the paupers. Those infirmaries outlived the workhouse itself, and they kept treating the poor long after the name over the door had changed. If the machine ever produced one thing worth keeping, it was this, and it had to be shamed into it. And that is the pattern hiding under the whole story. The workhouse was designed against one enemy and filled by everyone else. The blueprint of 1834 imagined the able-bodied idler, the strong man who preferred relief to wages, and it aimed all that engineered misery at him. Now, look back at the 7 classes and look at the wards, the aged, the infirm, the children, the deserted wives, the sick. Fear only works on people who have a choice, and most of the people inside had none left. If you watched the last episode, you already know one of them. A maid dismissed without a character had one door left in England that could not be closed to her, and this was it. Charles Booth surveyed old age in the 1890s and found close to 3 in 10 people over 65 drawing poor relief. The workhouse admission books filled with women the clerks wrote down as formerly in service. The 50-year career you heard about last time ended too often at this gate, and the country knew what it had built because its writers kept telling it. In January 1866, a journalist named James Greenwood put on rags and spent a night in the casual ward of the Lambeth workhouse. The door below the door, one night's shelter for a tramp, paid for with stone breaking or oakum in the morning. From the 1880s, some tramp wards went further and locked a man in a cell until he had broken his required weight of stone. The Pall Mall Gazette ran what Greenwood saw over 3 days, and the Outcry invented a whole trade because no English journalist had gone undercover before. 13 years later, a writer named George Sims published a ballad that opens, "It is Christmas Day in the workhouse." It became the best remembered thing he ever wrote. So how does a machine like this die? Slowly, and one of the people who helped kill it had come in through the front gate first. As an inmate, Will Crooks was born in Poplar, in London's East End, in 1852. In 1861, the family hit bottom, and the children went into the Poplar workhouse, and Will was 8 years old. He was sent on to a poor law school, the same kind of place that took Chaplin 35 years later. He often said the same thing about it afterwards. "Every day I spent in that school is burnt into my soul." Then he grew up, worked the docks, and came back. In 1892, Poplar elected him to the Borough Board of Guardians of the same union that had processed his family. Another working man was elected beside him, named George Lansbury. The workhouse master tried to bar Crooks from walking the wards without permission, because guardians were expected to govern the house without actually seeing it. Crooks fought the rule and won, and guardians across the country gained the right to walk into their own workhouses at any reasonable hour. Then Poplar made him chairman. The uniforms were abolished. The food improved. The old men got tea and tobacco. And what Poplar did became a model that other boards started copying. In 1903, Woolwich sent him to Parliament as one of the first Labour members in the Commons. The boy from the workhouse now sat where the poor law had been written. The rest took 2 more generations. The boards of guardians were abolished in 1930 and the workhouses were renamed public assistance institutions, which changed less than it sounds. The staff kept the title of master, and the neighbors went on calling the place the workhouse because that is what it was. The real sentence came in 1948, and it is one sentence, the first line of the National Assistance Act. The existing poor law shall cease to have effect. By then, the boy from the bakery van was 59 and one of the most famous men alive. The costume that made him famous was a tramp's, and he had worn it on screen for over 20 years. The bowler, the broken boots, the walk. Audiences everywhere laughed at the costume, and he knew exactly what it meant, because he had worn the real thing. The machine was built to make poverty frightening, and it worked on millions for a century. It just never made poverty rare. That was never what it was for. That's the story, and thanks for sticking with it. The last episode is about the women who lived one dismissal away from that gate, and it's here if you missed it. If you know another place that history built to be feared, put it in the comments. See you in the next one.